Okay, welcome back. We're going to start our panel discussion. I'm going to try to stay out of it to the extent possible. I'll just direct traffic as need be if required. But let me first introduce the panelists. From New York City, he's traveled all the way, is Dr. Charles Strozier, otherwise known as Chuck. He's professor of history at John Jay College, City University of New York. He's also a practicing psychoanalyst and author of a very important Lincoln book, an early investigation into Lincoln's intimate life, Lincoln's Quest for Union. Unfortunately, Dr. Thomas Mackey, the chair of the history department, couldn't come tonight, but we have his boss, which is better in a sense, Dr. J. Blaine Hudson, Dean, College of Arts and Sciences, Professor of Pan-African Studies, University of Louisville. Gerald Teets is here, Professor of Law, Temple University, a native of Springfield, Illinois, an old friend, a classmate of mine. Last but not least is Brian S. Bush, a Louisvillian, and he's author of the very important recent book, Lincoln and the Speeds, which is out on the table for sale, as well as Dr. Strozier's book. I said last but not least, but I really should give that honor to Ed Strozier, the director of Lincoln and Louisville, who's come from Philadelphia. Ed Strozier. Ed Shockley. Ed Shockley. Let's give a round of applause for Ed Shockley. Stand up. Come on. all 6'8". Ed is, I realize now working at a play that it's 50% director. 2 days ago, the play was just typing on paper, just a script. In 2 days, less than 2 days, really, Ed has brought this play to life in a way that I wouldn't have imagined. It's just astonishing. We started rehearsals at 12 o'clock yesterday, worked into the night about 9 o'clock last night, came back at noon today, and this is what he put together in about 12 hours of intensive work, and it's really amazing, I think. Thank you. Ed is a practicing director, playwright. Is doing a musical now called Armageddon in Philadelphia. Tell us a little bit about your work, more than.
I'm just a writer, basically. So, I've written about 70 plays. I've written a long time as a kid, but it's just a writer trying to make a living in difficult American times. And the good news, I won the Pew Fellowship for playwriting this year, so it means that for the next 2 years I'm financially secure. So I'm really, that's why I can do this kind of stuff.
Thank you, Ed. I think I just want your remarks as a response to what you've seen on this stage and shine it through your own personal lens. I'll start with Dr. Charles Shockley, okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, thank you, David. Pleasure to be here, and I've seen a lot of Lincoln plays and shows and movies over the years, so it was I think that this is quite impressive in the standard of the various productions that have been made, and it balances well the fidelity to the sources in terms of what one knows, as well as trying to develop some excitement, some dramatic excitement, and I know that it had a lot to do with that. So I think you ought to be congratulated. I think there are some. It was very interesting for me to see you take the visit of Lincoln to Louisville in August of 1841 as a way of probing something that really people haven't fully appreciated, I think, in Lincoln scholarship, and that is the significance for him of really seeing what the South was all about, and that is not something that has been. People talk about Lincoln when he went down the Mississippi in 1828 and was attacked by some slaves and got into a fight, but all the way to New Orleans. But really, far more important was the visit to Louisville in terms of really encountering plantation life. So, but maybe a couple of comments, just because something I've thought more about is just sort of the texture of the relationship between Lincoln and Speed. which is really the premise of the play. I think that's what brings it to, and that's what certainly fascinated me for many, many decades. And I think inevitably you have to sort of compress things in a play like this to capture it. But it is interesting. I mean, I think it's worth noting that there's a lot of writing that's taken this relationship and talked about it as much more intimate than is in this play, that I think goes way beyond what the sources suggest. But there's a whole literature that just since 2001 has flourished. A book in 2001, a book in 2008, all kinds of speeches just this last few years arguing that it was a gay relationship. And I mean, this is and it takes off from the fact that they slept together for 3.5 years. But more importantly, it seems to me the texture of the relationship is the sort of thing that the play tries to capture, and that is that they were very, and the fact they slept together really that's what men did in those days. They on the circuit, Lincoln slept with a lot of men, and they talked about the coffee being tough, and it was always like that. But that doesn't mean that the relationship was not unimportant emotionally. And it was a very important friendship in the latter part of the 30s. And I think it is very important that it was Speed leaving Springfield in late December 1840 that precipitated a kind of crisis in Lincoln and Speed had to come back to Kentucky because his father had died and he had to settle the plantation affairs. And that's what led to his to becoming, he was prone to depression, but he became suicidal in January of 1841. It's quite remarkable. And then this play picks up the following August when they visit together and all their interactions. But then when Speed went back to Springfield, but then returned to Louisville, and the early part of 1842, from January 3rd to February 25th, there's a series of letters, about 6 or 7 letters, which are, we don't have Speed's letters to Lincoln, but they're Lincoln's letters to Speed. And it's as Speed was courting Fanny Henning and having his own doubts. And Lincoln writes these very intimate, very almost passionate letters about how he vicariously experiences Speed's struggles with courtship in that period. And the crucial letter comes on February 25th when Speed finally married Fanny and clearly consummated the relationship. And the sky didn't fall in. So there was they shared these mutual anxiety. It's really an extraordinary letter. I mean, there is no letter like it in anything that Lincoln wrote to anybody else before, after, or in any other kind of writing betrays this sort of emotion and confusion, deep confusion. And it was after that. It was when Speed was able to reach out, marry, and then consummate his relationship with his marriage with Fanny, that Lincoln vicariously could work through his own issues. And it was from that moment that he then began to court Mary again. So the texture, and then married her the following November, so that the texture of their relationship is all bound up in the broken courtship with Mary, then the reunion with Mary, and this very important male friendship that was far and away the most significant male friendship in Lincoln's life.
Dr. Hudson, would you like to comment now?
Well, yeah, from perhaps a slightly different perspective, I guess my focus has been largely on antebellum history, of course, slavery and resistance to slavery, and straight into the Lincoln domain a good bit. Obviously, in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of business with people to talk about Abraham Lincoln in the past year or two, and largely from just the perspective of African Americans. So maybe I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes talking about the slavery side of this. And I'm familiar with Lincoln's visit to Farmington. I've done a fair amount of consulting there over the years in terms of their interpretation. Mm-hmm. And Yeah, I enjoyed the play. I think the use of some of the original sources, blending those into the dialogue, I thought was very, very well done. But the play, in some respects, confronts us with a very fundamental problem. Certainly, 100 and almost 70 years after the events occurred, and that is dramatizing with a reasonable degree of authenticity what daily life was like on a slave plantation for an audience that has no real immediate point of reference. And trying to do so without sinking into stereotypes entirely, without necessarily creating heroes and villains, because that's not necessarily the way they saw themselves at the time, obviously. And that, I think, is the real challenge, to make that scene real, and make Lincoln's confrontation with the reality of slavery on a daily basis, not so much the abstract principle of it. So I think I'm not sure anybody's done that perfectly, but I do think this play in its current stage of evolution, does a pretty good job of that. It's interesting because when I ran across some of the fugitive slave notices related to Farmington, there were a number of people involved with that site who basically dealt in what we call the Moonlighted Magnolias version of Kentucky slavery. And of course, there were people that certainly after the Civil War was over, wanted to believe that the Speeds, as a very prominent Louisville family, had never been tainted by slaveholding. And yet they were one of the largest slaveholding families in this part of Kentucky. And anytime you grew hemp, I mean, that was the big, the big slave crop in Kentucky anyway. And of course, that's what they were doing. And this whole notion of somehow you can have a genteel form of slavery, obviously doesn't make much sense. But I think the play does a good job of touching on the more brutal side, the references to the domestic slave trade, separation of families. I mean, that was something that was very commonplace in this part of Kentucky. And certainly, just based on the research we did about a decade or so ago, the Speeds had the same problems with their slave population that just about everybody else did. And whether people want to, I guess, make of the documents what the documents really were is often a challenge. But the evidence is simply there. And so you're portraying, in one sense, Louisville's past, not only Abraham Lincoln's past, where he intersects with it, in a way that would probably seem decidedly unfamiliar to most Louisvillians, and yet that's the way the past was. And so I think it's a play that's evolving in a very, very good direction, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah. The myth in Kentucky that's been perpetuated to a certain extent, and that's that in Kentucky and the border states, the slaveholders were a little more gentle and lenient with their slaves. Now, probably a myth, but Jerry, why don't you speak to that? Jerry's a northerner, he's from Springfield, where someone else lived, we know. What could you say?
I visited Farmington today, and I've never been here before, and in that, they call it that new room where they have the show now. After the show, we walked around, and one of the areas that discusses slavery and what happened in Farmington was a commentary about a letter, early 20th century, 1905 or something, 1905, by a minister. I think he was, I can't remember, maybe a Unitarian minister, saying exactly the myth that you talked about, that, well, we should be so proud of the Speeds because they were different, they treated their slaves very different and so forth. And when their slaves, and it said expressly, when the slaves ran away, Mr. Speed did not go after them. Well, they had posted right there a copy of an award of $400 for this slave who had just run away, and it's exactly a graphic illustration of the point you're making. It was very dramatic. It was very dramatic to see that. I was going to make another point, if I may, Dave.
Please,
I have a couple more minutes, and sort of follow up on what Chuck said. I appreciated your comments, and I noticed in the play today, I'd read a very early version of the play for David, and I was obviously very much aware of the changes you've made. I think maybe with you, Ed, some of them.
That's true, that's very true.
And one of them was the discussion that Mary has with Lincoln toward the end when she persuades him to think about what he's doing and the impact of leaving without saying goodbye and acting so rashly in effect. I thought that was very effective, and I'd never seen that before. But it's also very important to me because I think it, as we see Abe go through this process, obviously very compressed, this process with her, this is a dramatic illustration of the growing up, part of the growing up that Lincoln did during this period, and kind of culminates at the end of this period, which you mentioned, Chuck, by the time he finally thinks through, works through, correcting his breach of his honor and the breach of his resolve, and gets married to Mary Todd. That kind of is some people, we might not all agree, but I'm a little bit persuaded by it. This is the end of a very critical period, one of the most critical 10 or 11 years of Lincoln's life in a way. He has become much more mature. He's learned how to make judgments. He's learned how to see things in a much more nuanced way.
I view the play, I conceive the play as rather a meditation on friendship itself in general, not just this Joshua Speed, Abraham Lincoln friendship, but friendships themselves, the way they can thin out, the way they are altered, the way they changed. So I bring the discussion now to Brian Bush, who's just published a book, The Friendship of Speed and Lincoln. What do you have to say about the play as it portrays this friendship? Maybe you're not as sanguine about the way we treat it. Yeah.
In case anybody wants to know what they look like, I have pictures of Joshua and James. Of course, these are much older pictures of these gentlemen. I think the portrayal of James is right on. James Speed.
We really got that from your book. I acknowledge that. Okay. Thank you for
he
it.
has
Okay.
no sense of humor. He was very much an emancipationist very early on. When they annexed Texas, there's a really nice letter James Speed says right on there. He knew what this was all about. This is a big land grab, and this is just for to expand out the slavery territory. The only thing James Speed did not agree with when Lincoln was formulating the Emancipation Proclamation, he thought the states should have the right for Emancipation Proclamation, not the federal government. But I think what's neat, and I hate to be like Paul Harvey and saying here's the rest of the story, but it's neat the relationships, how they change through time. We're looking at a small segment here, but that friendship continues on all the way through Lincoln's life.
Yeah.
Let
me just interject there, and I'll let you go back to the play. Does not imply that their friendship ended. It certainly went on to the very end of Lincoln's life. They were together 2 weeks before the assassination, but it's our thesis that it thinned out, that the emotional content of the relationship dissipated in the months after their return together to Springfield. That I get from Chuck Strozier. They were friends, but it did not have the emotional power that it did a few months before, in that period. Okay.
I'm no Lincoln scholar, but
well, you are. You're a Lincoln Speed scholar.
Just a little
you continue a little bit. Okay, so we don't say that it went on, but its power as an intimate relationship weakened, and I happen to know when it's thought that when Lincoln came to Lexington, Kentucky in 1847, when he was elected congressman to Washington from the state of Illinois, he visited his wife Mary Todd in Lexington for 3 weeks. He came by Louisville, stopped here, but he didn't visit his good friend Joshua Speed on that occasion, just a few months later. Okay. The other thing, and I think you point out these things in your book, is that this is actually in David Herbert Donald's book. During the presidency, David Herbert Donald, who just passed away, a very eminent Lincoln scholar, reports that Joshua Speed proposed that another man, Joseph Holt, a Kentuckian, run against Abraham Lincoln in that second election. Now, I would personally consider that a betrayal of my friendship, but they were still cordial. They helped each other in other matters, in supporting the Union's strength in Kentucky and so forth. So I see the relationship as thinning out, becoming more limited, but continuing in an important way for both of them. So, want to say a little more about that? You can agree or disagree.
I think they were just they were taking separate careers in their lives, and that may be a thinning of the relationship too.
Right.
I see it as
sure.
they're starting to have, well, at least for Abraham, he's starting to have a family. Joshua, I mean, it's kind of funny because Joshua Speed actually writes to Abraham Lincoln. He says, "I'm thinking about getting in the plantation business and farming. You know anything about that, Abraham?" And he's like, "No, I don't know anything. You're on your own." Yeah. He's starting to go on to his political career. Joshua now goes into with Fannie Henning.
Well, that's a part of friendship. The way friendships divide and thin out and change, unfortunately, it can be tragic. They also got married, started their respective families, although Joshua Speed didn't have any children. Is that correct? He didn't have any children?
Yeah, he didn't have any children.
That's right. So that's life, you know, and so... they were very, Joshua Speed was a businessman, a very successful businessman here in Louisville, had a real estate empire after he left the plantation. Lincoln wasn't really a businessman at all, you know, they had different, but they remained friends, there's no question about it, and the play doesn't want to indicate otherwise.
All this is great. This has nothing to do with the success of a play. This doesn't help me in the least.
We know that, we've heard that. We want to hear more.
Audiences can care less about all this stuff. Audiences, because one of the mistakes that people make with historical plays are to think that audiences care about history. If that was the case, on Saturday night we go to a university and hear a history lecture. We don't care about this stuff. History plays are supposed to make us excited to go read these books. I'm supposed to see a play about Lincoln and go, I know the play's not true, so I want to see the real story now. And then we go to find the historian, because the historians won't lie and treat whatever. So the question I'm interested in more, each of you represents thousands of people who would buy a ticket to see the play. And so things that confuse you, things about character that didn't work, things about plot that didn't fit together, the amount of humor, things that, on the theatrical experience, how this particular play affected you, held your attention, or lost your attention, is honestly the only thing I'm concerned about. That's the only thing that will help dramaturgically move the play forward. And then that'll tell us which things from which of the books and which questions we ask historians. Like I know, for example, the black characters aren't yet written as humans, and there's some major holes there. So I'm curious to see how you felt, the things that worked for you, so we can know what things to keep and what things to cut.
So one thing I would suggest right off the top of my head has to do with how the black characters speak and the content of their speech in the presence of whites. And I guess my sense is that in a plantation environment like that, you would probably not see people express their own opinions quite as much. They would dissemble. One mechanism that could obviously be used is to let them speak to each other, and then you could bring out those ideas much more fully. But the sense of wearing the mask is probably a good one to keep in mind. And there's no reason to believe that relations were more open between the Speeds and the enslaved African Americans on their plantation than you would expect to find elsewhere.
Well, could I say something along those lines? I don't think you would have Lincoln shaking the hands of a slave in 1841. I think Lincoln was, if you look at the growth of his attitudes, his racial attitudes, I think he always, as you mentioned, the 1837 petition with Dan Stone, he always, from a very early age, demonstrated even from childhood, where his father opposed slavery, he hated slavery as an institution, and he was totally consistent about that all of his life. But he really until the war, he basically had white supremacist ideas, and he was a racist. I mean, he was less hateful than most white men of his age, but he had ideas about racial, that whites were superior human beings, and I think what the remarkable part of the story of Lincoln is that he transcended those racist attitudes. So, but this is a period where the struggle that I think this play allows you to capture is his revulsion at the institution, at the same time his inability to truly comprehend blacks as fully human. I mean, and I think that's what I was looking in the program, I don't know why I can't find it, I'm sure I read it in here. Where you have, when he returned, he wrote a letter to Mary Speed in the fall after he got back to Springfield. And that's where he described that scene which you have in the play about
We twisted that around a little bit.
And that's a very important quote, because I think it shows that where he describes seeing on the boat, seeing the slaves, and they're all tied up to the thing, like so many fish on a trot line. And I think that objectifies it. It does not comprehend the suffering and just before that passage in the same letter, he says they're all there, and the reason they're on the boat is that they're being sold downriver. They're going to harsher slavery further south, and he remarks that the condition still, yet they're happy. He can't believe that they're happy when he's feeling so depressed. But then he had this image of like so many fish in a trout line. It's a dehumanizing, it's an objectifying image, and I think that's what he really didn't transcend that till later. He did, but much later, not in 1841.
Yeah, no.
So I think having him shake the hand is like it's collapsing too much.
Yeah, you got to get to Frederick Douglass almost. That's
Yeah,
the way
1864.
That's right, that's his life.
Right.
You know, Frederickson said something a couple of decades ago that I think captures Lincoln's attitude, that he saw African Americans as men but not as brothers. Now, a lot of whites didn't see African Americans as men. And Lincoln certainly didn't see them as men in quite the same way he saw whites, certainly not at this stage in his life. But, you know, he would, and you'd see this in the Lincoln-Douglas debates and other places, at least believe that African Americans should be endowed with certain constitutional rights and protection of the Constitution. But the white supremacist idea stays there for a very, very long time. And he's a long way away from that.
I like this idea of having a different kind of dialogue in the presence of whites, but then you could have scenes in the slave quarters where they're speaking truth to each other about what they're really feeling, but not speaking when he confronts in fact, Mrs. Speed, there's some things he says to Mrs. Speed.
As well as Clouser, that said you couldn't get away. But there's this thing called code switching, one of the tools we use. And so code switching would be where you speak, like you use, I might say, where's your laboratory to my grandmother, and where's your John to my buddy. You know, we have different languages with different places. Job to them, and it's always laboratory at a job interview. So the slave ship would do code switching, as well as the other characters. When the Mrs. Speed is around, the brothers and sisters can't talk in front of their mom the way they talk for somebody else as well. So as we add these other drafts of the play, those elements will make it much more rich. We can find these sort of things. Chris, the same question for Speed, though. What was Speed's attitude towards blacks in the same period?
Let me just get to that, because the principal source for the play is the 1855 letter from Abraham Lincoln to Joshua Speed, which is really the last significant letter, okay? And in that letter, Abraham Lincoln takes Joshua to task very clearly for his slaveholding and his attitude politically toward slavery. That's very clear, and that's one of the bases for our ideas in the play, the 1855 letter. You all know that, I'm sure. And he makes Joshua remember the little quote that he had made in the letter about the Negroes strung together precisely like so many fish upon a trot line. He says to Speed, that made a big impression on me, and I really didn't like what I saw. At least he's saying that in 1855. He may not have felt that in 1841, but this is something I know that scholars quarrel about. Chuck, you want to speak briefly to that, and then I want to open it up to the audience. Okay. Well, two letters, and they're varying
I think he
views.
writes that letter in 1855 because he wants it to get out to the other slave owners in Kentucky. He wants to make clear that he's separating himself.
But this is a personal letter.
1855 is very late.
It's a personal letter, though. It's not a political speech. It's
those kind of letters. He wrote a letter like that to Herndon. When he would often write letters where he would want it to say he was getting the word out to Speed as a major slave owner in Kentucky that what his position was on slavery.
Right.
This is and the big change when Lincoln
But would
goes back
Speed
into
share
politics.
that? Would Speed share that letter with anyone?
Of course he would share.
Would he?
If you got a letter from Obama, you wouldn't keep it to yourself.
I think that was for public consumption.
If I recall.
Okay, well, I think it's...
Well, he's got a line in that letter, too, about how a great body of northern people crucify their feelings or something because they have to essentially tolerate slavery in another part of the country if they're going to be loyal to the Constitution. And that whole debate over the extension of slavery, of course, was raging at that time. So he kind of, was taking a stand in relation to that.
Well, let's open up to the audience. Do you have some comments and questions? My classmate over here from Eastern High School.
I just wonder, Lincoln being Lincoln in my mind anyway, would Lincoln maybe have, instead of offering his hand, would he maybe offer his hand to touch instead of, he wouldn't have done that either? I mean, he wouldn't have.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think he may well have made a gesture. He was too kind.
Well,
deep
he's
down.
such a kind man. I just
Yeah.
wondered if he might just put his hand on his arm as a gesture of kindness.
I think you can go back pretty far in Lincoln's life and the history, the documents that illustrate it, and find that he had serious misgivings about slavery, if not, I think a fairly deep-seated opposition to it. But he also had some of the ideas we've talked about up here relating to I guess, the humanity of African Americans, or certainly the equality of African Americans and whites. And then this notion of respecting the Constitution, which at least protected slavery in the slaveholding states. I think seeing slavery up close and personal, if anything, might have strengthened, I think, his personal abhorrence of slavery. Whether it takes it all the way to the limit that it would reach later in his life, I couldn't say. But I don't think it necessarily does a lot for his views regarding race. And Lincoln, I think, was caught on the horns of that dilemma, like many Americans were at that time. Now, of course, Lincoln reconciles it, at least in the abstract, by supporting colonization. And the notion you get rid of slavery, but then you get rid of the folks who have been enslaved too. So I don't get the sense that the visit had any real impact on his racial thinking, but it may have strengthened his sense that there was something fundamentally wrong about slavery.
You really do have to separate, as you've effectively done, his view about slavery on the one hand, and his very personal view about blacks on the other. I think, and it seems contradictory.
Yeah.
It really seems contradictory. There's some scholars who think, and I don't know any reason to argue against it, who think that he maintained that distinction and the racial attitudes, at least to some extent, probably to the very end of his life. Now, he had important experiences. Somebody mentioned Frederick Douglass. That was a very important experience for him because he got to know a black person for the first time ever in a pretty intimate way.
What do you think about it? I mean, from a practical point, just considering ourselves, it's easy to be opposed to the institution of slavery, whether they be white or black or whatever, and yet still hold some kind of prejudice, as we all do. Let's be honest with ourselves. We all have some kind. So slavery is one thing, and just our personal feelings about other people is rather a different matter. And I think that when we consider Lincoln, we have to consider that. Okay. Yeah.
It's interesting, but Lincoln didn't really see as a very young child. I mean, left with himself, so he really didn't see slavery. But it was around him, but it wasn't. He didn't experience it in any direct way. He was too young. So then he goes to Indiana. He's raised. Then he moves to Illinois. He takes one boat trip to New Orleans in 1828 when he's a young man. His only direct experience of slavery was his trip to Farmington. And the next important thing he did, the letter, the thing you talked about, the petition with Dan Stone in 1837 is very abstract. It is an intellectualized opposition to slavery as an institution. That's important, but he hadn't seen slavery. The only time he saw slavery was in Farmington, and the next most important thing he did was in 1848 when he was elected to the 30th Congress. One of the first things he did was to introduce a bill for gradual emancipated compensated slavery in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. Now, it was gradual. It was over half a century. It would have ended in 1898. It was compensated, so it was in one sense, it was very moderate, but it was a radical move. He was laughed out of Congress. He was regarded as a radical abolitionist. He spent years in the 1850s in Springfield having to fight down his reputation in Washington as an abolitionist. And so it's interesting. I mean, I hadn't thought about it. I've never thought about this, and although you asked that question, that the only time he really saw how the institution worked was in Farmington. And the next most important thing he did is 1848, when he's introduces, he's elected to the 30th Congress, and he introduces a bill to end slavery in a part of the United States. It was the first time that any legislator in the history of the United States had introduced a bill to end slavery anywhere. Now, it went nowhere, and he was laughed out, but nevertheless, he took that step.
But I think what's important about the visit to Farmington, as was just mentioned, once slavery begins to end in the North and then the old West, Northwest Territory after the American Revolution, you slowly evolve into what amounts to almost like two nations under one government. And as time goes by, more and more people who live outside the slaveholding states only know what slaveholding is in abstract terms. The number of free black people scattered in the northern states and the West was fairly small. So I mean, you're going to have just a small percentage of free people of color as you kind of go from town to town, if you have any at all. And so over time, Northerners saw slavery very much in abstract terms. And of course, to some extent, that made them susceptible to the Southern rationalizations for slavery, because if you don't see it and you don't know what's going on, and somebody talks about it like a patriarchal system, well, how do you know, right? Except those crazy abolitionists saying it's something different. Well, maybe it is a good system. But when you see it up close and personal, that's a very different experience. And to some extent, when you think about the effect of something like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which dramatized a reality of slavery that had an impact in the North and even in other countries, that made it real in a sense that it really had not been for a lot of folks outside the South. It's a powerful experience.
Can I have some more comments from Charles?
Well, I understand at Farmington he would have experienced slavery in a much more projected way, but surely he saw slavery as he went to New Orleans. He saw slave trading. He saw.
He had seen it, and it had a powerful impact.
And he went there twice. He went there twice.
Yeah, he went there twice. That's right. But I think the extended living with, the sort of staying with Speed, and I mean, it was a. He saw it working on it. He was visiting a city where there was slavery. He saw auctions. He was appalled, and it had an impact on him. But he hadn't lived on a day-to-day life where the slave quarters were, the kind of code language, and the way people treated each other. And
I wonder though that, as I understand, Judge John Speed was very active, as you said, in the colonization effort. And it appeared to me that the Speeds were very guilty slave owners. They had, on the one hand, they did want to present themselves as, these, benevolent stewards of their slaves, but at the same time, they had the same problems for the most part. I wonder would they have been referred to as slaves or as servants on Farmington?
And it was very common for them to call enslaved African Americans servants. And certainly, as you kind of climb the social ladder, that was very common. Just like the statement that the Mary Speed character made about, if you're going to whip somebody, don't whip them on the front porch. Take them in the barn or let it happen out of sight. So it could be in the bottom of the jail in the city, or someplace where it's out of sight, out of mind. But it didn't, I think, take away from the fundamental hypocrisy.
One of the problems for Lincoln scholarship and biography and their play itself is that the letters from Lincoln to Speed exist for the most part, many of them, but none of the letters in response in this period exist or have been found yet. Now, Brian, what would you say about that? A very, very difficult problem for everyone in our Lincoln community. Yeah. Where did those letters go? Where are they? Do they exist? I mean, they went to Lincoln. What did he do with them? Did he throw them away? You can only infer what Joshua says from Lincoln's response and vice versa. So maybe Chuck can speak to that. But Brian, what could you say? Where are those letters? A rhetorical question.
I mean, maybe, like I said, I'm not a big Lincoln scholar, but if it's not mistaken, I think Mary, after Lincoln was assassinated, she got rid of everything. I mean, she burned the love letters, if I'm not mistaken, between the two. She got rid of the dresses, her jewelry. She wore black the rest of her life. And she went into mourning. I mean, they had to kick her out of the White House practically, saying, "You're not the first lady here anymore. You gotta go." I mean, she was very torn up, and personally, I don't blame her. I would be too if I lost a child while in the White House and then lost my husband. Then she had lost a child even before that.
Right.
So this is a woman that's got some massive tragedy in her life. But from what my understanding is, she probably destroyed a lot of those letters.
Oh, that's an interesting theory. What do you have to say, Chuck? Where are those letters?
I think Lincoln threw them away. Remember, the crucial letter is February 25th, and he writes, and this is after he's gotten the letter promised on the 13th that about what happened when he got married. And obviously, consummated the marriage for Brooke didn't fall in. But in that letter, he writes one letter to Speed, which is the real letter, which is very intimate, and oh my God, this is incredible. I'm still, 10 hours later, I'm still trembling, he writes. And then he encloses with that letter a second letter, which is much more innocuous, which is a letter that he could show to Fanny. So he has a secret letter to Joshua, and so the relationship was a very intimate. It had overtones of closeness that implied a kind of exclusivity. So I think I suspect that he imagined that Speed burned the letters that he sent him, which he didn't do, because I don't think he needed Mary to get rid of his letters. Maybe he did.
So you're saying that Lincoln himself destroyed
I bet
them.
Lincoln
That's
himself.
what you're saying.
Right.
He destroyed the
Right.
letters.
And I think he probably just assumed that Speed did as well.
Could Mary Todd have destroyed some of those letters?
Well, we don't know.
That's Brian's
That's
thought.
Brian's
He
theory.
has a different theory. So this is what you encounter in Lincoln.
They're gone. All we know is they're gone.
I mean, I think she was perfectly capable. Lincoln realized that Mary Todd was a tremendously valuable asset to him in terms of his political life, and knew that she would really be a great support for him to go into politics and perhaps even to the presidency, as far as the presidency was.
She was the skin of a very distinguished Kentucky clan.
Right.
She did know Henry Clay, and as a kid, she was raised with political ambitions, and she, I think, one part of her attraction to Lincoln was saw his enormous political potential, and encouraged it and pushed it along, and that was part of his attraction to her. That he was a political animal, and she was tremendously ambitious, and that they were totally in agreement in all respects in terms of their relationship.
And if I could just
she
interject,
was
the
very
dichotomy that
important.
was going on at that time.
Can I just say one thing? At the play, I think you could have more about the friendship. It could be a more complicated play about the friendship, and which balances that. Right now, I think the slavery sub dominates it, and I love this idea of somehow finding a way of working in some of the real letters, so that this incredibly complicated, nuanced, and not contradictory, but just enormously complex relationship with Speed, which was like no other relationship he had in his life. And this is an opportunity to bring more of it out.
I think there might be other plays that use that sort of letters, that back and forth letter thing, that device.
The love letters and
love letters and things like that.
It's a
Kind of
device
foreshadowing,
It's a device
too.
from back to Scribe. I mean, there's a play called The Letter by Scribe. I mean, letters have been a major device for exposition, and there's no really dramatic obstacle, especially since letters don't exist, and that gives you carte blanche to do whatever you want to do. So you basically create the letters that you want.
Dr. Heston, if we followed that tact, do you think that would take the focus off our exploration of slavery and African American life? Or
Not necessarily.
I mean, it's a balancing act that we've been continuing to struggle with.
I think you've got a scene or some parts of scenes that could probably be rewritten in terms of the dialogue that would bring sort of the history and the depth of the friendship out in more detail, that wouldn't necessarily have to be inserted at the expense of other parts of the play that may relate to slavery. So I think it's more a question of how those parts of the play are used and the substance that you try to convey.
And Mary, as a child, loved her mammy more than her stepmother. She lost her own mother. And so he had these strong feelings for this woman who loved her mammy and would ask her mammy if she could help give food to the Negroes who had escaped and were going on the Underground Railroad. And then, for some reason, emotionally or whatever, their relationship broke up. He found himself at Farmington. But you know, all of us are not the same people today that maybe we were 10 years ago. The seeds were planted in Farmington, and he evolved himself. Mr. Lincoln evolved himself and grew, and his thoughts about slavery changed.
You have a problem. I mean, the only evidence that you're going on is the letter that Lincoln wrote to Mary in terms of their relationship, and it's a very formal, proper letter. So for the kind of touching that went on, which would have the problem, it'd be unlikely for a woman to be that physical with a man. But also the letter that Lincoln, a month later, wrote to Mary has this tone. It's not formal. It's friendly, but it's not intimate.
Yeah.
It's not intimate.
In real life, Mary Speed was a woman of 40 or 41. She was born in 1800, and she was unmarried at 40. And I don't know how old Amy, the woman who plays her in the play, is, but she's not in her 20s. I can tell you that. She's a grown woman, has children.
We can actually then do more subtle choices instead of common choices.
Okay, well, we'll call it an evening. Thank you for staying on. I think it's been